you'll see that we don't actually have a plug-and-play magic bullet to mix metaphors for these problems we've been raising. But what I hope you will see by the end of my talk, and even more by the end of John's talk, that we do have some rather concrete things to say about ways of going about thinking about methods and choosing methods and designing them. So that's why I've called this talk, this first talk of the day, Steps Methodology, because as I guess folk know, the difference between method and methodology is a way of thinking about methods. They're often used interchangeably and in inaccurate ways, but a method is a particular way of investigating something in our context, and a methodology is ways of thinking about those different ways and having reasons for why different methods might suit different tasks. So what we're really talking about is not just magic bullets, but building up a repertoire, like in music, complementary parts of the whole that work together in different contexts. And our task is appreciating alternative pathways. And we use that word very deliberately, appreciating, because we're not trying to separate out knowledge first, then action. Understanding before you practice. Because knowledge is action. Action is made from knowledge. And often people, as we've been discussing in many of the discussions here, will act when knowledge is manifestly incomplete, because it's always incomplete. So appreciating is a word just to try and get us to think more about, yes, understanding, but also having values, applying values to it, and appreciating the nuances and the open-endedness of methods and of the different pathways. So that's the reason for putting it over that way. Now I'm going to start by going back to some slides that was shown right at the beginning of the summer school about the basic nature of the challenge we're facing, about building robust knowledge about alternative pathways and their different contexts. And actually it picks up on a term that became a bit controversial in Mike Hulme's talk, where he got heckled for using the term underdetermined. And it's kind of interesting because that's right at the jugular vein of many of the issues we've been discussing about, do we really need to open it up this much? Do we really need to bring in the complexity that STEPS seems to be interested in bringing in? And I would answer to that a fairly simple answer, yes, we do. Because the reality is out there, but it's underdetermined. The knowledges we have cannot fully, comprehensively prescribe what are the implications of that knowledge. So it's not anything goes, we'll talk a bit about that, but it's underdetermined. The realities are underdetermined by our knowledge. So the dilemma that causes is because within that, for example, a systems sort of understanding would take a particular part of that knowledge, interacting social actors, different types of environmental processes, technological infrastructures, all interacting in various dynamic ways, and it will make a focus on part of it, and it will regard the rest of it as like the environment of the system or the scope for analysis. So any given method, any given type of knowledge will focus in on something of interest and do so against a background, and it'll have something to say about both. And there'll be all sorts of stories told, all sorts of narratives about what the causes are, what the effects are, who the relevant actors are, etc., within that picture. Now that's as far as a typical systems analysis will go, and it gets very complicated when you start integrating social, environmental, and technological things together. But that is not far enough, because as Adrian outlined, what we also have is different perspectives on that. Different knowledge perspectives from local people, from government, from business, from different agencies, from different academic disciplines, will configure the picture of the scope and the focus of the systems being looked at in different ways, with different highlighted causes, different foregrounds, different backgrounds, different emphases. So the challenge, then, of methodologies to understand and appreciate alternative pathways is to get a grip on the way these things work together. And over time, the central kind of insight that we really work around in the pathways method is that over time, these factors reinforce each other in certain ways. They're mutually reinforcing. to produce particular pathways of innovation, particular energy strategies, particular agricultural strategies. But notice the reinforcing here is not just reinforcing within the system, but reinforcing between what happens in the system and how it's looked at. Because the way you look at a system can be part of that reinforcing process. The narratives, the framings of the system can reinforce the pathways that are taken. So what we're talking about then is a whole range of different factors, the imaginaries we have about the world, the power relations, the discourses, the practices, expectations about the future, what we expect to happen in any given context, whoever we are, will typically have a reinforcing effect on the likelihood that that thing will happen. A practical example of that is financing. If financiers believe something will happen, they'll put a lower discount rate, they'll be more likely to invest, and it becomes more likely because they think it's likely. So these are examples of the kinds of positive feedback effects that all come together to constitute pathways. So we're dealing then with a range of different phenomena. The social and material world, different scales, different levels, different actors and networks, all these kinds of factors, each one of which has a host of methods arrayed at it. And in fact, academics will fight each other to the death to defend the differences between these kinds of things. But they're all implicated in different ways in this reinforcing process. If we want to appreciate the nature and the implications of different kinds of pathways in the ways we've been talking about, we do need to get to grips with this horrible complexity. So my point on this complexity is, and I'm going to say some quite specific things about how we deal with it, but the basic argument is that complexity is not made by the pathways approach. It's there, whether we like it or not. And our choice is the degree to which we are reflexive about it and that we engage with these kinds of complexities. Now, I should say a few words about reflexivity, I think, because it's a much used term, quite overused actually. A lot of social scientists will talk about it and sometimes be amazingly unreflexive about the way they speak of reflexivity. But which is so many ironies in it that it disappears in a cloud. At root, it's just a capacity for self-reflection. And in our context, it's about understanding how the answers depend on the questions, which questions we ask and how we ask them. That's reflexivity. It's kind of very practical, very obvious, but often neglected because it's inconvenient. It's inconvenient to disciplines whose prestige and status often relies on them being very confident about the knowledge they profess. And it's inconvenient often to decision makers who, one can sympathize with them, need justification for their decisions. In case it goes wrong, they've got something to blame, as we've discussed in earlier sessions. It's a very difficult political environment, and it's not a criticism to say that, it's a fact of life. So being reflexive is very important because it actually allows us to stand back from this and actually help other actors who may be slightly imprisoned by these kinds of forces. So one of the things that people often come back, especially people trained in natural science or economics of various kinds, and challenge, quite understandably, this kind of approach that I'm outlining and we've been talking about is, but doesn't this just mean anything goes? How can we say what's right if we're doing all this reflexivity, all this plurality, all this complexity? We've got to do things. We need to know what we think. We need to take seriously we might be wrong. Take seriously error and the quality of knowledge. And I hope this is helpful. It's of course another 2x2. But it's a 2x2 just to try, as all the others we use are, not to categorize the world, but to try and make us think about different questions that can be asked. And here, I want to just illustrate how there's a difference between taking error seriously and taking the quality of knowledge seriously, which we do, and being reflexive about the ways the answers depend on the questions. And it goes like this. The degree of reflection over the robustness or the quality is up here on the vertical scale. And the degree of reflexivity over of how what we think depends on the context is on the horizontal scale. And in this picture, I'm going to show both normative ideas of what's right and epistemic ideas of what's right. So in other words, we can speak of what's right or wrong, both in terms of what's correct or not in terms of knowledge, or what's right or wrong morally or normatively or politically. And it's true of both sides that a naive realist position has low reflexivity and low reflection about error. It says one thing is precisely right. This is correct, it's exact. And that's the body language of a lot of disciplines. Very high number of significant figures when a model is presented or a cost or a risk is assessed. Very precise, very definite. One thing is precisely right. But that's not, when things are pushed, typically in our field, what gets acknowledged is, well, we can't ever say what's exactly right. We know what's approximately right. A kind of fallibilism coming out of Popperian philosophy of knowledge. One thing is approximately right. So that's quite reflective about the fact we might be wrong. Now, the caricature of relativism is anything goes. So we're not saying anything. Everything, all things are equally right. Everything in that space of normative possibilities or epistemic possibilities, they're all the same. They're all equally right. That's what the philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, was caricatured as saying. Now, we're not in any of those. We're talking about this condition. Contrasting interpretations of the world are equally right, but there's a hell of a lot else that's just plain wrong. It's possible to be wrong, but there are many different ways of being equally right. It's a pluralist view. It's not anything goes. We can say things about what's right and wrong, and the methods that we're going to talk about are ways of identifying that space, identifying those domains within which different perspectives, which are valid and legitimate, hold different interpretations of what's true, normatively or epistemically. That's the challenge. So, just to remind us then, let's get a little bit more practical now about what that all entails. The aims are to help appreciate alternative pathways, and without wanting to belabor the slogans, I wanted to just go through the reasons for those words, because they're quite important. The word help is because method alone can't do the whole job. Methods are catalysts, they're provocations, they're heuristics of any kind of method now I'm speaking of. Because what really matters in the implementation of method are the practices around it, the institutions, the cultures really matter. So there's a danger sometimes of giving the impression that, whether we're critical or positive about a method, that we're somehow reifying it as existing in isolation. And we'll see in a moment how that's not the case. So methods only help to do this. You need a lot of other things going on around the method for it to do its job properly. I've mentioned the word appreciation, both understanding and judgment, knowledge and action. We're really interested in alternative pathways, not just trying to open up a space for discussion of there being different pathways in an agricultural challenge or in a infrastructure, energy infrastructure or whatever else the sector might be. Not just that there's a plurality of possible things that could happen in ways we've talked about several times, but actually those ones that tend to get most forgotten are the ones that are most associated with the needs of the most vulnerable people. So marginal people, people who are less powerful, more resource poor, will typically suffer a double vulnerability. First, because whatever gets done, the trickle down to those communities is typically less than those who are privileged by the approach. But secondly, because the particular trajectories of change that are followed, with or without trickle down, are not favourable to those groups, not the ones that would most favour those groups. So we're interested in alternative pathways for those two reasons. And we're interested in repertoires of methods because we want to be sensitive to context and positioning and the plurality of views on the different pathways. So we are thinking then about an ordered repertoire. We're thinking about not choosing one method, but thinking about how they fit together and helping to give people practical guidance for why they might take different methods in a particular project and put them together, or in different contexts, why different methods might suit. And having said what I did about the stickiness of methods, the fact that the context really matters, the institutions in which they're set and the cultures in which they're set matter, is the following. You remember this chart I showed at the end of the uncertainty talk, where the aim of methods is to get away from this reinforcing process where we have lock-in processes, channel decision-making and commitments investments into particular strategies in particular areas that are viewed very narrowly, in very narrow risk terms, in ways that Mike Hulme was challenging, among others. Narrow in all the ways I said, delivered as if knowledge just gives you one true answer to politics. So politics then has a very circumscribed debate, which then feeds back into the lock-in processes. And the methods we want pick up on the signals at the end of that talk that we should make more of a space for this kind of emergent decision-making that I show with the flocking behaviour of birds in the middle, the space for political discourse, especially for marginal voices to come into that discourse and be influential by doing a series of things, broadening out the scope of the knowledge, the issues, the values, the uncertainties, the different pathways, the perspectives on the pathways, broadening out what's taken into account and opening up the way those understandings are delivered to politics. Very different things, opening up and broadening out. One's about the inputs to knowledge, one's about the outputs from knowledge, if you want to put it simply, into politics. And we're also interested, as we talked about earlier, in diversity in the actual things that are done. So the methods then fit in this context. They're there to help inform institutions. They're there to help provoke and enable a greater space. They don't do it on their own, but there are ways in which methods can help to cultivate that space, even when they're set in an institution that may not like them. In fact, especially when the method is in an institution that would prefer to get a more final, definitive answer, it can be quite radical if it just opens up another choice and says, hang on a minute, there's another alternative here. So broadening out and opening up then, in those senses, exactly those senses, provide the axes on which we can think about methodology. Because yet again, you guessed it, another 2 by 2, we have a space. We have the inputs, the things that are taken into account within the practice of research or policy appraisal, depending on the context, in the ways I outlined, can be more or less broad or narrow. And the outputs can also be relatively, have the effect of closing down or opening up. So opening up in this context, remember, means being plural and conditional. It means saying not just do A is best, but saying if X applies as a perspective or an assumption or a value, then do A. But if Y applies, do B, which is being more rigorous about the knowledge. So that's the opening up part. And what's interesting about this, I hope, is it's a way of thinking about methods that spans a remarkable scope of what are normally divided disciplinary cultures. For instance, the deepest one is between quantitative and qualitative. One can speak of quantitative and qualitative in this way. Quantitative methods can be very broad and very open. They tend not to be used that way because the cultures of quantification assume it means aggregation. But they can be used that way. And I hope we can talk about that in the course of the day on particular methods. And likewise, deliberative approaches can be very narrow and closed down. Now let me just illustrate that. Take any given method, of course, in this space will not be a pinpoint, in keeping with the analysis I put earlier. It'll be a field, because the devil is in the detail. You can't just say a method means a particular thing. You have to really think about how it's implemented. And sometimes relatively minor tweaks to a method can really alter where it falls in this space. For instance, sensitivity analysis, even on a cost-benefit analysis, do a sensitivity analysis to say, hang on a minute, what happens if we change the discount rate? That's a recommendation. I would make that. There are thousands of parameters in a typical cost-benefit analysis, but as any economist knows, but doesn't typically get talked about in delivery, change the discount rate, you typically totally change the answers. And there is no one firm justification for one discount rate over another, even in economics. So, no method is a point in this, but they are general fields. So for instance, in decision analysis, we might use it to look at safety in the narrow way I talked about in the uncertainty lecture, getting a picture like this where we think we've got a very clear picture of who's best, who's worst in terms of the options. Or we may use it like this, so it gets a bit broader and a bit more opening up because we're looking about the uncertainties and we suddenly see how much uncertainty is, and you can actually justify different interpretations in the way I went through before. Or we use it like this, where not only are we seeing there's uncertainty, but we're exploring the conditions. We're exploring that conditional property that, well, if you assume like these guys do with this knowledge, then you get this answer, and if you assume like those guys do, you get that answer. So here's an example of how a particular approach can vary radically. But likewise, the same is true of citizens' juries, and we talked about the tendency for participatory methods, when they're practiced, also to emphasize closure. Consensus conferences. Citizens' juries have a verdict. The pressure to deliver justification applies just as much. So we really are escaping the romanticization here of participatory and deliberative methods and putting them on the same basis as quantitative methods. Now, with all those caveats then, here is a very inadequate population, each one with a big space around it where it extends under different conditions, of methods that we might consider. Green for participatory, interactive, deliberative. Blue for expert, analytic, quantitative. I'm not going to stand or fall on the positioning of any one of these. People, I can see, are already beginning to get annoyed. What's that doing there? It should be up there. The point is to catalyse discussions about the conditions under which, in keeping with the analysis, being reflexive, the conditions under which methods might be here or there, because that's what really matters. But the point is, about doing all this, is to recognise the subject end of knowledge, that actually power operates in knowledge to close it down. Just like on the uncertainty diagrams, power pushes attention up into the top left corner. Methods that, because they're narrow and closed down, deliver justification, are favoured. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to be neutral by counteracting these effects of power. Simply to follow it is not to be neutral. It's to go with the grain, like an iron filing in a magnetic field, lining up with power. And that's what often academics think is being neutral. Just line up with power and you're being neutral. We're trying to say, no, power is not a bad thing, but it has an effect on knowledge, it has an effect on methods. Let's think about it, let's be reflexive, and let's be neutral by balancing that, by deliberately emphasizing, not to the exclusion of other things, there are a place for all these kinds of methods, but to introduce discussion about where we might want to be down on the bottom, the broader methods, and on the right-hand side, the methods open up. So again, you see what we're doing here? We're coming up with quite concrete ideas about how you choose methods, but not prescribing a particular one. But we are highlighting now a range of methods that look quite interesting. Now, on the methods website of the STEPS Centre, we've gone through a few pages. There's a rather embarrassing version of this talk, broken up into little chunks, fortunately for people's sanity. We've got a whole series of resources which we're hoping to develop and really wanting to work with colleagues like yourselves and other alumni to help develop this. And particular features, there's a lot of features I won't tell you about, but we have methods vignettes, which we're developing further at the moment, but we've got a whole series of methods in there: intervention histories, innovation histories, multi-criteria mapping, participatory impact pathways analysis, photo voice, system histories, methods that we've practiced within the team or with our collaborators, and we say something about the conditions under which they help broaden out and open up appraisal. And what situations they fit, what they fit less, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. Very short little accounts, which we're developing further, and we really welcome comments. And if you talk to us about what you might be interested in, we'd be welcome contributions down the line. And we also talk about the way these methods fit together in projects, because there's virtually no project that only uses one method. So those are some of the resources that I don't have time to do justice to, even though we're at the early days in populating it in this talk. But I want to just point you at it, if you haven't seen it already, because there's quite a lot of material there, lots of links to websites. And we're developing it further. I won't go through this in detail, but you can just see the density of this is a whole series of different websites we're putting together, resources, platforms for different types of methods, positivistic methods, natural science methods, interpretive methods from social science, interactive methods, group deliberation techniques, quantitative methods of other kinds, and looking at the temporal dimension, histories, and the time dimension, futures, and reflexivity, ways of being reflexive in different conditions. So you see where there's links here. This is work in progress, which we're going to work into the website. And again, if you discover a really cool tools website that you think is relevant to us, doesn't have to do the job, but we'd be very grateful to hear about it and take it into account. And maybe if it does go with the type of analysis we're wanting to explain, then we'll be grateful to use it. So this is just another way of underscoring the message that there's a whole variety of different methods. You don't need to feel, if you practice a particular kind of method, that you're automatically not, the steps framework is not relevant, because there will be details of those methods and ways they can be fitted together with other methods that will work with this framework that we're talking about, even if some of those details are quite radical changes. Now, I also want to say a few words about disciplinarity, because one of the most important features of the ways in which methods are implemented is the disciplinary context. And I don't think any of us, we wouldn't be here if we were, any of us, a monodisciplinary worker. I mean, that's what gets people to the summer school, I think. And I think the frustration sometimes of that predicament, it can be invigorating to be an interdisciplinary researcher, but you get a hard time typically, especially when you're an early career. I'm seeing a few, actually I don't want to carry on like this, people might burst into tears. But disciplines can be quite oppressive. They'll only ask certain kinds of questions, and if you don't have the agency in it, you can actually find yourself in a difficult position. So it's kind of interesting to think about disciplinarity and the different ways in which methods fit together, because it's not just about the methods themselves, it's about their environments, their cultures. So monodisciplinarity is the normal way in which a particular academic work in an academic department takes place. Like, for instance, let's take Q method. It comes out of social psychology. It's a method that we're interested in. We're going to talk about it this afternoon. Rose Cairns is going to come in and do a how-to session in the afternoon on Q method for anyone who's interested in that. But the important point is I put a red circle around it because this is an analytic method subject to a particular discipline. Social psychology, certain sort of understandings about world, quantification, ideas about individualism and social discourse as a product of individual positions. There's a number of assumptions built in to how it gets conducted. So every approach, whether it's expert or participatory, exists within a set of rules from a discipline. Likewise, a typical participatory appraisal will embody rules and assumptions about how it's good to conduct a process, how to recruit it, how to facilitate it, how to interpret it. Will all be given by particular disciplines. Whether we like it or not, that will be the case. So cross-disciplinarity is a way of challenging those kinds of features, finding out the extent to which what the method tells you depends on its disciplinary context. So you get more authority to the result of a cross-disciplinary work because you're juxtaposing things and allowing them to interrogate each other. So you have a participatory panel provides a complement to a discourse analysis, for instance. So you double check, you triangulate it. Multidisciplinarity is quite a different thing. Multidisciplinarity is the type of approach taken in these enormous integrated assessments that we talked about, like the IPCC or IPBES or the Global Energy Assessment, etc., etc. And what these do is acquire enormous scope. They're not typically, they're done by hundreds of researchers typically, but you can get multidisciplinary teams that are smaller than that, where the basic structuring of the disciplines is ordered. Each one has its job. It's plug and play. Okay, you guys are doing the social effects. You guys are doing the environmental effects. You guys are doing the technological aspects. And then everything gets fitted together, often with a modeling component, ordering it. Maybe it's a cost-benefit oriented or ecosystem services. Something's organizing it and disciplining the others to be subordinate, to have inputs. And that really matters. It matters to the results. So that's multidisciplinary analysis of time that's common in our field. Interdisciplinarity is different from that. Interdisciplinarity, the methods speak to each other without that imposed power structure. So the design of how they fit together is not dominated by a particular school of thought, but negotiated between them, and done so in relation to the problem. So an interdisciplinary inquiry tends to be more problem-focused. It's not like, well, the molecular biologists have the highest standing here, they have the biggest grants, they have the most people in the Scientific Academy, so they run the show, and when we investigate agriculture, we do so in an organized way around what genetics can do for us, with ecology and sort of extension work and social science all coming in just underneath. Instead, interdisciplinarity involves a much more equal collaboration between the disciplines in ways that directly address whatever the problem is. So it's quite different from multidisciplinarity. And then just to bring in a final, there's loads and loads of different types of disciplinarity. Don't worry, I'm not going to go any further. But transdisciplinarity, you see the green coming in here now, because transdisciplinarity is getting out of the academic comfort zone and engaging, but not just engaging within a method, like a typical participatory method, but engaging about the design of the research, about where the problem focus comes from. So engaging with stakeholders, and in our terms, especially those who tend to get most often excluded, engaging not just like, let's come and talk to you about a problem that we've thought up, but let's talk to you about how we investigate the problem. What is the problem? Because so many researchers, many very well-meaning researchers find themselves going to sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, to talk about nanotechnology, or to a northern English town, to a citizens' jury on nanotechnology, and the people in the citizens' panel say, well, why have you brought us in here to talk about nanotechnology? We want to talk about schools, or we want to talk about our livelihoods. So this is a way of engaging faithfully with the perspectives, not just within the research, but around the research as well. It's transdisciplinarity. So I hope that addresses at a number of levels quite concrete things we can think about in choosing methods. As I said to you, I'm not going to prescribe a particular method here. We're going to talk about methods in a particular project context with John. Then we're going to look at methods that we've all used and think together about what the implications are. And at the end of the day, we're going to look at multi-criteria mapping, participatory pathways assessment, and Q method. And I'm very happy to organise other methods at the end of the day which we've got capacity to look at. We can talk about that. But I want to finish now by just summarising in a way our best attempt to come together about some of the practical questions, because it's still quite bewildering. How do you do all these things with these kinds of methods? How do you be interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinary in the choice of methods? And the basic steps to appreciating alternative pathways in these terms are not so complicated. First of all, you engage the actors. You identify who the actors are relevant to that problem. Make sure you're picking up the ones who are most often excluded. Ask them who the other actors are and snowball it. Start with the actors. Then explore the different narratives, the framings, but the framings are part of stories. So explore the different narratives that these different actors tell about this problem area, whether it's agricultural, transport, waste management, whatever it might be. What are the stories that are told? What other actors pop up in those stories? New actors come in as a result of other actors' stories. Then characterize the dynamics. What are people telling you about the different pathways that are there, dimly seen, not happening necessarily, what Melissa refers to as bush paths, what Ian talked about as bush paths compared to motorways. What are people saying about those possibilities? And then reveal the strategies of the actors in relation to that. So these things aren't just passive. People have strategies. They're bringing them in. Think about what those are and what the actors think they are. And this is, of course, not a 4-step and then you're done. It's an interactive process, and we can say quite a lot about the particular questions within each as well. I'm not going to go into detail here, but this is, of course, the slides are available. The website's available that goes into this a little bit more. But these are just provocations, questions to ask yourself at each stage. Now, no analysis of this kind will ever address all these questions. These are not like a formula, a menu. You must do all these things. It's a set of points to provoke and challenge. Say, think about these, because you'll know which one of these might be most relevant. But have a think, at least when you design the work. Even a doctoral project might think about which kinds of these things are more relevant. And a doctoral project will, of course, do much less than a typical large-scale research project, let alone an integrated assessment. So we've populated specifics, prioritising the most marginal, snowballing I mentioned, triangulating, always looking for plurality, addressing different notions of sustainability, different ideas of the system, different stories that are being told. The dynamics brings in issues that Ian talked about resilience. What kinds of shock are people worried about? What kinds of stress have they got in mind? Because shock and stress have very different implications, as Ian outlined at the beginning. So make sure we're not missing out these ideas of shock and stress. They're a great way of looking at the different stories that people are telling, what shocks and stresses, and what kinds of strategies then get taken, the political actions, the political interests in play. And again, a series of specific questions. So this is our attempt to try and help guide the application. We don't want to prescribe particular methods. Some are better than others, but not unconditionally so. We are basically saying, and this is my final slide, we want to identify alternative pathways for institutional, technological, cultural change in different sectors as seen by the people. And we do so by opening up and broadening out, and by using methods, both quantitative and qualitative, in ways that are more broad and more open, and which interact together because no one method solves it. So think about those designs in that interactive, interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way. And in doing that, one can say some quite concrete things about the kinds of process one goes around using these methods. And that is, as far as I want to go in this talk, it is of course quite general. It's about principles and guidelines. We're going to see in a particular context from John after this how this played out in a very particular project, in a real setting, just to give it more grounded. But of course that will be very specific, and then there's a danger of thinking, well, hang on, that method's very particular. Well, we're not recommending that particular method, we're using it to show how it's done. So I'm going to end there. I hope it's made some sense, and I really welcome any comments people want to make. Thank you.